Hi everyone, it's Lauren and welcome back to another episode of Page to Screen. In this series I take a classic book and discuss the different ways that it's been adapted in film and TV. Today we're going to be looking at Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. There will be spoilers for the plot, obviously, for Far from the Madding Crowd all the way through this video. And just to recap the plot for those who haven't read it and watched all the adaptations as recently as I have, this follows a young woman called Bathsheba Everdeen who inherits her uncle's farm. And there are three men who are in love with her in various different ways. There is Gabriel Oak, who is her shepherd, who used to be a farmer, suffered a misfortune and now is working beneath her. There is Mr. Boldwood, who is a rich farmer in a neighbouring farm, and Sergeant Francis Troy, who is a more dubious character perhaps, who is a soldier, and Bathsheba runs off with him. The first adaptation I watched was a film from 1967 starring Julie Christie as Bathsheba. I remember watching this when I studied Far from the Madding Crowd at school and thinking it wasn't a great adaptation. Watching it back now, I can see why I didn't like it originally, because it's quite dated as a film, but as an adaptation, I was actually really impressed with it. I don't love Julie Christie as Bathsheba. I think she's okay. I think she does an alright job, but I don't think she brings a lot to the role, if I'm honest. I think it's very difficult to portray Bathsheba as a likeable character because I don't think she's written that likeable in the book. She's described as vain a lot of the time, and really she uses her vanity and she uses the fact that people find her attractive to get them to do favours for her. She relies on Gabriel Oak a lot without giving him very much in return, and she's very impetuous and silly. But at the same time, she does have strength, and I guess her more questionable decisions come from her naivety, really, rather than her being a bad person. But I think there's actually quite a lot there, and it's difficult to get that balance right. I think Julie Christie does portray her as just quite vain, and you know, I don't think she really cares that much about people's feelings that she seems to hurt, and she doesn't really, to me, seem to get into the subtext of the character. I think it's very much a reading of what Thomas Hardy wrote, which I don't think is a very favourable persona, in my opinion. So in terms of adapting Bathsheba, maybe she's doing okay, but it's not what I would want as a character, I don't think, if you want the audience to find her appealing and likeable. But something that I think she does do well, and so does Alan Bates, who plays Gabriel Oak, is their sort of love for each other, or the unstated love for each other. I really believe this relationship throughout the film, which I think is actually very well done. I was also really impressed with the pacing in this film because, you know, it's a long book and this is just a film, it's not a TV series, but it feels like it gets all of the important information in there. And we also have time for some really beautiful shots of Dorset, or the fictional county of Wessex where this is set. And it also seems to really evoke the feelings of the country. They use a lot of folk songs all the way through, some different people singing songs, which could slow the film down, but it doesn't, and it really adds to the atmosphere. I also think the Boldwood and the Sergeant Troy are pretty good in this film. Terence Stamp is Sergeant Troy, and I think it's good. I think everyone's done a very sort of basic adaptation of those characters. I think Sergeant Troy is also a very difficult character to really get right, because he comes across very slimy in this, which obviously is the way that they've decided to go, and that does work. I think the difficulty though with portraying Sergeant Troy as such a kind of slimeball, sleazy character is that when he discovers that Fanny Robin has died and he declares his love for her, I don't believe it, because I just don't believe that he ever loved Fanny, really. I didn't really understand why he wanted to marry her in the first place, because he just seems like a playboy. So there's a little bit of difficulty there, but to be honest, considering this film's age and the fact that, you know, it's fairly dated, I think it's still a really good adaptation of the book. The next version that I watched was from 1998, which is a made-for-TV adaptation starring Paloma Baeza as Bathsheba. This is such an interesting adaptation. It's about 3 hours long, I think, so it's very, very much longer than the 1967 film. And in some ways, that makes it a lot better, and in some ways it makes it a bit slow. But it's good. It's equally a good adaptation, I think, but for really different ways. Something that this adaptation does really well is the cast of characters. In Far from the Madding Crowd, you have a lot of the rustic farmers talking a lot, and there's a whole cast of characters in the book which aren't really that important, and if you're doing a film you could just cut them all out, but in the book it kind of adds some depth and adds some atmosphere to the piece. And these characters are done so well in this adaptation. You really get all of their conversations about what's going on. It adds a level of humour and, like I said, a level of atmosphere. And I really enjoyed hearing the kind of quips and quibbles and discussions of the maids and the farmhands. I actually think it added to it rather than it slowing the plot down. Paloma Baez's portrayal of Bathsheba is a really interesting one, and I actually quite like it. Even though it's not necessarily what I want from Bathsheba, I think she takes a really different turn with her, which I really appreciate, and she makes her seem very, very young and very, very naive. In a way that I don't really get this when I read the book, but when I watch it on screen, I just think, yeah, okay, that makes sense, that she's just really young. When you have situations such as Gabriel Oak proposing to her and her not knowing what to do, or Boldwood just pushing her, saying, marry me, marry me, marry me, give me a promise, marry me, and her not just telling him no, you can see that it's almost because she's just such a young girl and she just doesn't know how to handle the situation. So she tells him, oh, okay, yeah, I'll tell you later, because she just wants Boldwood to go away. And I really get that, rather than taking the angle that she's vain and she's leading these men on. It's more a case of she's kind of in over her head. She is vain and she is silly, but only because she's just, you know, a very young girl, and someone like Sergeant Troy can lead her on because she doesn't really know any better. The only problem with this kind of portrayal is that, on the other hand, Bathsheba's taken on a whole farm by herself and dismissed the bailiff, and perhaps that aspect of her personality doesn't marry up with the naivety that she shows in her other areas, in her social endeavours. So it did mean she lacked a little bit of, I hate this word, but feistiness. She lacked a little bit of strength, but nonetheless a really interesting take on Bathsheba as a character. Something else I absolutely loved about this version was the Sergeant Troy and the Fanny Robin. Troy in this isn't sleazy, he's actually so charming. And I really liked that, because when Fanny goes to his barracks and talks to him, like the little smile that he gives her, I was just thinking, oh, if I were Fanny, you know, I'd be going weak at the knees right now. But he seems less like he's playing around with her and more that he actually genuinely loves her. And the way that he woos Bathsheba as well, even though we know he's not that interested in Bathsheba, he really turns it on. He turns on the charm, and again, you can see how you would fall for someone like that. The next film that I watched is maybe not quite a strict adaptation of Far From the Madding Crowd, but that was Tamara Drew starring Gemma Arterton, which is an adaptation of a graphic novel, which is an adaptation of Far From the Madding Crowd. This was okay. This is a country village in Dorset, and Tamara Drew grew up there with a big nose and then went away, had a nose job, and has come back all successful, and then everybody's in love with her. Same thing as with Bathsheba. So we do have the same general premise as Far From the Madding Crowd. The exact plot points and what happens is quite different. Some things that I did really like, however, were there were some real specific things that happen in Far From the Madding Crowd which are mirrored in Tamara Drew, and I thought that was quite nice. So for example, when you have Bathsheba sending Boldwood the Valentine's card and causing a whole stir, there's one of the teenage girls in the village sends emails from her account, and it's like, oh, you know, I really fancy you or whatever. And it's the same thing where that act causes a ripple of a chain of events. There's also a scene where a dog gets on the loose, and this dog has been on the loose the whole time, and eventually it herds up a bunch of cattle and gets them to stampede, which again mirrors what happens right at the beginning of Far From the Madding Crowd, when Gabriel Oak's dog shoves all his sheep off a cliff and ruins him. So a couple of things like that I really liked, because I felt like they were a nod to Far From the Madding Crowd. However, if I'm honest, watching this film just made me want to read the graphic novel. I imagine the graphic novel's quite good. I did feel like the plot was put together quite well, but I didn't really love the film. I didn't really warm to any of the characters. There's an affair that Tamara Drew has with someone which I just found really unbelievable, and I didn't really like the way the film focused on the fact that she'd had a nose job and now she was pretty, and also the way it was pitting the women against each other. I just wasn't sure about it, and elements of it made me uncomfortable. So as a film in itself, I don't think it was that well put together. There are some really good actors in it, and there are some genuinely funny moments. And finally, we have the most recent film adaptation from 2015, starring Carey Mulligan as Bathsheba. I went into this thinking I was really, really going to love it, and it was okay. It was okay. It wasn't really what I was hoping it would be. Carey Mulligan, as expected, is absolutely wonderful as Bathsheba. I think she's my absolute favourite portrayal of her, to be honest, across these adaptations. She's just so good at demonstrating depth of character that she really just plays into the subtext and gives Bathsheba her own personality. She doesn't rely on her being vain or being neurotic or naive or whatever. She just feels like a fully fledged human being who is flawed, and I think she does that really, really well. And similarly, Michael Sheen as Mr. Boldwood, oh my god, I mean, I love Michael Sheen anyway, but it's fantastic. Like, it's such a wonderful, wonderful portrayal. You could really see the turmoil in his mind and just how much he is obsessed with Bathsheba and how worried he is about rejection, and also how deluded he is at pushing that rejection down and thinking, oh no, she doesn't really mean it, it's fine, she loves me. And he is absolutely brilliant, and I just wish I could take both of them two out of this film and put them into maybe like the TV adaptation, because I didn't really like the Boldwood in that either, and then I would have my perfect my perfect adaptation, because they were fantastic. This film though just didn't really have anything. It felt very style over substance, I'll be honest. And I would say it's because it's a film and perhaps it didn't have enough time to include all of the scenes. But the 1967 adaptation manages to, you know, be short enough that you can have it in the cinema and also include enough of the plot. And I just felt like too much was cut out of this. And we had a lot of beautiful swooping scenes of the countryside and also a fair amount of dialogue, which is just not Hardy's, and also give the story a bit too much of a modern bent. There's a lot about Bathsheba being the only woman going into the corn market and trying to make people buy her corn, and them not listening to her, and her saying to Lydia, oh, you know, don't worry, we're just as important as they are, we can do anything men can do. And I was like, this isn't in Far From the Madding Crowd. Like, I know you're trying to it's an aspect of it, but we're making quite a meal out of this, and considering they cut out other scenes which I think would have been really beneficial, there's no need for this whole corn market scene and all this dialogue which just feels a little bit too anachronistic. Something else I was so disappointed about and I felt fell really flat was the Sergeant Troy and Fanny Robin scenes. Fanny Robin is played by Juno Temple, which I think is a fantastic choice for Fanny Robin, and she's just wasted in this film. We only really see her, I think, right at the beginning running away from Weatherbury, and you don't get interaction between her and Sergeant Troy before their wedding. You just see her leaving, you see her going to the wrong church, and then you see her again when she dies, and that's it. We get nothing more there. And again, I think it just gives the wrong impression as to who Sergeant Troy is, because in the book, they go to the wrong church when they're supposed to get married. Fanny eventually finds him and says, oh, I'm so sorry, I went to the wrong church. He's like, no, you've embarrassed me enough. I'm not gonna get married to you anytime soon. And maybe they would have got married, you know, in a month or two, but he's just really angry at her. But in this version, he never finds Fanny again. So she doesn't turn up to the church, and then he doesn't see her again until she's pregnant and, you know, she's about to die. And he's going, oh, where were you? I looked for you. And I just think that really gives the wrong impression, because actually Troy wasn't head over heels in love with Fanny and she just ran away. The situation was more complicated than that. And I just didn't really appreciate the way they changed people's motives and just gave the wrong impression as to what was going on. Equally, when Boldwood is really in love with Bathsheba, he's really aware that Gabriel Oak is also in love with Bathsheba and like discusses it with him, which I just think we didn't need this. I just don't really like the way that this film was adapted. I don't really like the way the story was mangled and mismatched around. And I didn't even care at the end when she got with Gabriel Oak, which is like one of the best things when they finally get together. And I just felt that the Oak was quite wooden or just a bit nothingy. I just didn't really care. And it just felt like a wasted opportunity, this film. And yeah, I think that's what annoyed me more than anything. If you hadn't read Far From the Madding Crowd, you could probably watch this and enjoy it. But knowing what I do about what the plot is supposed to be, it was just so frustrating. So I would love to hear your thoughts on any of these adaptations if you have seen them. My next page to screen is going to be on Great Expectations, which will be in 6 weeks' time. So I will have a chat with you in the comments and see you in my next video. Bye! I have been reading a lot more about feminism and gender theory recently. Last month I did focus a lot on the actual feminism, and although that's something that really interests me, I think as a woman reading about feminism a lot, it can get quite exhausting and it can make you feel quite angry a lot of the time.